Today's program is the third in this year's series of Heritage Month's programming. The series is called Sharing Stories, Sharing Heritage, and it's designed to explore and celebrate the connections between objects, narrative, and community. The Smithsonian Institution celebrates 5 Heritage Months throughout the year: Hispanic Heritage Month from September 15th through October 15th, American Indian Heritage Month in November, Black History Month in February, Women's History Month in March, and Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in May. For each of these months, the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies joins with colleagues throughout the institution to present a keynote event that brings the unique cultures, experiences, and traditions of historically underrepresented people to the public's attention. Upcoming programs include the Women's History Month feature event, which will take place the first Sunday of March, again in this auditorium, and that will be a screening of the film Searching for Angela Shelton. A woman sets out to meet other Angela Sheltons across the country, and she discovers that over 70% of them have been victims of sexual abuse, which is a pretty startling number for just a random accounting. And the host for that program, it will be a showing of the film and then an interview with the director, and the host for that program will be Heather Taylor, who has her own radio show here in DC called The Heather Taylor Show. And that will also include a tour of women artists at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The Smithsonian Institution also offers a wide range of programming for each of the Heritage Months, and please just check out the website listed on the back of this program or on that bookmark in there, and you'll see everything that's going on, including resources for teachers. I'd also like to take an opportunity to extend an invitation to all of you to help plan heritage programming. There's a place on the survey in there, number 8, where we ask for your ideas for programming, and if we use any of your ideas, we'll credit you, and it would just be fun to get more involvement from the community. Sponsors for today's program include the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, and the Smithsonian Heritage Month Steering Committee. For Let Your Motto Be Resistance, the exhibition, national tour, and catalog were made possible by a generous grant from the lead sponsor, MetLife Foundation, with additional support provided by the Council of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Special thanks today to Jackie Serwer, the Chief Curator at African American History and Culture, and also to our American Art Museum docents Edmund Bronder and Nathan Grimsley, who will be giving a tour after today's program, and also to our many colleagues, interns, and volunteers who helped put the program together and who are here today. Today's program is being recorded for our web archives, so we ask you to please turn off your cell phones. And also, when we have Q&A at the end of the show, there are some microphones set up halfway back to just ask your questions into the microphone so that future people can actually hear the question in the webcast. Now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker today, Lonnie Bunch. Historian, author, curator, and educator, Lonnie G. Bunch III is the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum for African American History and Culture. In this position, he is working to set the museum's mission, coordinate its fundraising and membership campaigns, develop its collections, and establish cultural partnerships. Rooted in his belief that the museum exists now, although the building is not in place, he is designing a high-profile program of traveling exhibitions and public events, ranging from panel discussions and seminars to oral history and collecting workshops. As a public historian, Mr. Bunch has spent nearly 30 years in the museum field. He's regarded as one of the nation's leading figures in the cultural historical community. Mr. Bunch is also a prolific and widely published author. He has written on topics ranging from the Black military experience, the American presidency, and all Black towns in the American West, to diversity in museum management and the impact of funding and politics on American museums. Mr. Bunch has held numerous teaching positions across the country, including American University here in D.C., the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth College, and George Washington University, also here in D.C. He received undergraduate and graduate degrees from American University in African American and American history. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Lonnie Bunch.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let me hear it again. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. There we go. You know, I'm always struck whenever I'm introduced that sometimes I worry that they're going to tell you everything I did other than the fact that I was president of my third grade class 2 years in a row. And there's hope for everybody. I want to welcome you to this celebration of Black History Month, but I know you're really here to celebrate the victory that my Giants will have over the New England Patriots this afternoon, which will clearly be the biggest upset since Harriet Tubman beat the plantation system 150 years ago. Let me begin thinking about Black history with a story. During my sort of 5-year sojourn at the Chicago Historical Society, I became very close to a woman named Mamie Mobley. Mamie Mobley was the mother of Emmett Till. Many of you remember Emmett Till was that teenage boy that was killed in Mississippi 52 years ago. And when I would sit with his mother, she would talk passionately for hours about her Emmett. And she would talk about how her job was to help people remember Emmett, to remember the poison of racism, but also to remember the possibility of change. And I remember one of our last conversations just before she passed. She said to me, "I wonder what will happen if I die. I wonder who will remember." And then she said to me, she said, "I hope that those of you that care about museums, that care about history, will somehow help people find a way to remember." And so as I thought about Black History Month and its continuing importance, I kept thinking about finding a way to remember. And I would suggest to you that nobody played a greater role in helping Americans to remember, in helping Americans to understand the African American experience than Carter G. Woodson. This is the man we all know that created Negro History Week back in 1926. Woodson was the second Black American to get a PhD from Harvard, following the great W.B. Du Bois. But what I think was important about that experience is that Woodson's whole academic life told him that African American culture, African American history, was much too important simply to be left in the hands of a few academics. He believed that his role was simple, that he was to use Black history and culture as a weapon in the struggle for racial uplift. By 1916, Woodson had moved to D.C. He had created the Association for the Study of Negro Life and Culture, an organization whose goal was simple: to make Black history accessible to a wider audience. But Woodson was a very interesting man, a very strange man, a very driven man, a man whose only passion seemed to be history. One of the people that I respected a great deal was a historian named Lorenzo Greene. And Lorenzo Greene had worked for Carter G. Woodson during World War I. And he used to tell stories about Woodson. And one of the stories that I think captures Woodson's real passion was that Woodson used to work his young graduate students, almost work them to death. And it was a Friday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, and Lorenzo Greene had, as he put it, the date of his life. He had finally found the woman of his dreams, and he was taking her to the Howard Theater. Unfortunately, at 4:45, in came Carter G. Woodson saying, "I need you to do this project so that I can have it first thing on Saturday morning." Lorenzo Greene said, "But Dr. Woodson, it's Friday night, I'm 25 years old, I got a date, how about a break?" And Carter Woodson said, "Son, history can't wait. And so you can imagine what happened. The night goes on, Lorenzo Greene decides, you know what, Carter Woodson will never find out. He goes out on his date, having the time of his life. He leaves the Howard Theater, and you know who he runs into. Carter G. Woodson comes walking up to him, eyes his date, eyes Lorenzo Greene, and just says again, history can't wait. In some ways, this impatience of Carter G. Woodson, this notion that history is too important to wait, really led him to create Negro History Week, as he called it, in 1926. And he created this week in part to celebrate the birthday of Abe Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. He wanted to make sure that people knew that this was a creation out of his respect for Lincoln, most importantly, out of his respect for Frederick Douglass. What I think is important is for us to realize that when Woodson creates Negro History Week, he doesn't create it out of a vacuum. It really is created in the 1920s during a period of real interest in African American culture. It's a period where the Harlem Renaissance really captures so much of America's attention and interest in black life. You remember the Renaissance, that period with amazing writers like Langston Hughes and Georgia Douglas Johnson and Claude McKay, who wrote about the joys of blackness. And musicians like Duke Ellington and my favorite Jimmy Lunsford captured the new rhythms of the cities that were created in part by the thousands of new blacks who migrated to these cities. But it was also a period where artists like Aaron Douglas and Richmond Partey created images that celebrated blackness and provided a rare, positive image of the African American experience. It was a time, in essence, when for many people, black America was in vogue. And Woodson hoped to build on this interest. He wanted to stimulate interest in black America through Negro History Week. And his goals were simple. Woodson believed that he would use history as a tool to prove to white America that black America had played an important role in the creation of America. And therefore, black Americans were worthy of citizenship. He thought that by celebrating heroic figures, be they inventors or entertainers or soldiers, we would, in his terms, prove our worth. And once you proved your worth, he felt, equality would follow soon thereafter. But his other goal was also to create a sense of possibility and positiveness for the African American community. He felt that mainly the image that most people saw of black Americans was a negative. And he cited the fact that in February 1925, the Washington Post ran 50 articles about Negroes, to use his term. 48 of those articles were negative. Woodson felt it was crucially, I was going to say, well, that's still the Post, but that's another conversation. Woodson ultimately believed that this Negro History Week, which became Black History Month in the mid-70s, would really be a vehicle for racial transformation. But the question that we ought to ask is this movement, is this month still relevant? Is it still a vehicle for transportation? Or is it simply become a time when schools quickly gang all their assignments together on black life? Or whether it's a period when, for children, this has become less important, whether you are black or white. In some ways, has Black History Month simply become a time to program? When television stations and media put all their black plays on. I was traveling the other night and I couldn't sleep, and I was watching Turner Classic Movie, and suddenly there was Hattie McDaniel, so I knew it was February. And so the question really is, how needed is this month? Has things really changed? After all, only but a few, but the most ardent, I shouldn't use this word in public, rednecks, would deny the presence and the importance of the African American in today's society. But I must admit, even my youngest daughter a child who grew up in the Smithsonian, started her life at the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center, is now in college, asked me, "Dad, just how important is Black History Month?" As she argued, she said most of her friends, we see the Colin Powells, the Oprah Winfreys, we see the Condoleezza Rices, that most of her friends are immersed in Black culture. They see it on television, in the movies, in music. And she argued powerfully that America had changed dramatically since 1926. And her question to me, is it not time to retire Black History Month? Should Black History Month be as outdated as those old colored and white drinking fountain signs? Now, I will spare you the 3-hour lecture she got. She would never ask that question again. But I would like to suggest to you that it's important to think about that. And then after thinking about it, I would argue that despite the profound changes that has occurred in our lifetime, Carter G. Woodson's vision for a Black history as a means of transformation and change is still quite relevant, still quite useful. I would argue African American History Month or Black History Month with a bit of tweaking is still a beacon of change and hope and possibility that is sorely needed in this world. One can argue the chains of slavery are gone, but not everyone is free. One could argue that the great diversity within the Black community desperately needs the glue that is the African American past, the glue that helps us to remember, that binds us together, that helps us realize that there is great benefit of taking joy from what has changed. But there is so much further to go. And while I would suggest to you there are many reasons why and examples of why I could point to, let me point to 4 things why I think the African American experience still has such strong meaning, such strong resonance today. I think the first reason is simple. It is simply the danger of forgetting. I think that you can tell a great deal about a people, about a nation, by what it deems important enough to remember, what they build monuments to celebrate, what graces the walls of their museums. Think about as you travel the world. Throughout Scandinavia, there are monuments and museums that cherish the Vikings as a proud symbol of Nordic curiosity, exploration, and freedom. In Scotland, much is made of the heroic struggles of William Wallace, who we know as Mel Gibson, to throw off the yoke of British domination. And until recently, South Africa was dominated by monuments to the Voortrekkers, those Dutch that supposedly conquered South Africa. While in America, we traditionally revel in Civil War battlefields, and founding fathers, with an occasional president thrown in the mix. Yet I would argue you learn even more about a country by what it chooses to forget. This desire to omit, to forget disappointments, moments of evil, and great missteps is natural and it's instructive. And I would argue to you that it's often the essence of African American culture that is forgotten, that is downplayed. Yet it seems to me the African American experience, more than anything else, is a clarion call to remember. There is so much of the African American experience that needs to be remembered. But rather than spend the next 6 hours talking about that, let me just give you a few moments, just a few, what I think, extraordinary moments that were transformative. I mean, there are many events that we could mention when it comes to moments of the African American past that are worthy of remembering. How could you not explore? How could I not celebrate the impact of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or the election of Carol Moseley Braun as the first African American woman to serve in the Senate? And how could you not celebrate the business acumen of Madam C.J. Walker, or the Black cultural expressions, whether it's the wonderful performance of Sidney Poitier in Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun, or that amazing concert in 1939 when Marian Anderson sang on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter morning. Or even, we couldn't forget Chubby Checker and his dominance of the radio raves in 1960 and 61 with the creative names The Twist and Let's Twist Again. But it seems to me there is more. We could think about the lyrical poetry of Langston Hughes, or the power of a Jack Johnson, or the tragedy that was the Scottsboro Boys. But it seems to me, rather than sort of go into great detail, let me just pick 3 or 4 moments that I think have propelled this struggle, moments that maybe we don't think about, that are crucially important to understand who we are. I would suggest to you the first moment is simple. It is really one of the last great unmentionables in public life. It is the story of slavery. For nearly 250 years, slavery not only existed, but it was the most dominant force in American life. I didn't say one of, I said the most dominant force in American life. Political clout and economic fortune depended upon the labor of slaves. And almost every aspect of American life, from business to religion, from culture to commerce, from foreign policy to westward expansion, was informed and shaped by the experience of slavery. Think about it. American slavery was so dominant that 90% of the world's cotton was produced in the United States. We were the OPEC of the 19th century. And by 1860, the monetary value of slaves outweighed all the money invested in railroads, banking, and industry combined. And the most devastating war in American history was fought over the question of slavery. And yet I would suggest to you there are still not enough opportunities to help people discuss and understand slavery. Not only to understand its history, but to understand its continuing meaning and resonance for us all. I think about a survey that we did here at the Smithsonian many years ago, where we wanted to assess the public's knowledge about slavery. And the results were fascinating. 81% of white respondents felt that slavery had little or no meaning for them. But even more troubling was the fact that 64% of the African Americans surveyed expressed either little interest or a level of embarrassment about the question of slavery. I would argue there is a great need to help Americans understand the history of slavery, and that it matters because much of our complex and troubling struggle to find racial equality in this country has been shaped by America. And until we understand the contemporary resonance, the contemporary meaning of slavery, we will never get to the heart of this Gordian knot of race relations. But I would argue, even more importantly than that, we have to find ways to help people, and especially African Americans, understand, accept, and not be embarrassed by their slave past. In many ways, when I look at slavery, I am not ashamed of my slave ancestors. I'm in awe of their abilities, in spite of cruelty, to maintain their culture, their sense of family, their humor, and their humanity. In some ways, I wish more people knew this wonderful line that William Prescott, who was a former slave who was interviewed in 1939, he was asked, "You're one of the last slaves left. What do you think people will remember about slavery?" And William Prescott said, "They will remember that we were sold, but not that we were strong. They will remember that we were bought, but not that we were brave." I would suggest to you that remembering slavery is one of the most important things we can do. But I would also suggest we ought to remember what happened after slavery. We ought to remember the story of a simple man, a man named Hawkins Wilson. Hawkins Wilson was an amazing man who, in 1867, from Galveston, Texas, wrote a letter to the Freedmen's Bureau and said, "I was a slave and I was sold away from my family 24 years ago. I would like your help in finding my family. I want to be reconnected." And listen to what he said in the letter he wrote. First, the letter to the Freedmen's Bureau, and he says, "I am anxious to learn about my sisters, for whom I have been separated many years. I have never heard from them since I was sold into slavery 24 years ago. I hope that they are still living. and I hope that you can find them. But then even more powerfully, he included a letter to his oldest sister that he hoped the Freedmen's Bureau would pass on. And the letter said, "Your little brother Hawkins is trying to find out where you are and where our poor old mother is. Let me know and I will come see you. I shall never forget the bag of biscuits you made for me the last night I spent with you before they took me away. Your advice to me was that if we don't ever see each other again on earth, we will meet in heaven. And I have worked hard to make sure that if I don't see you here on earth, I will see you in heaven." And he goes on in this letter to talk about what a good life he led, hope that he would find you. And then he said, "Write quickly, because I want to come see you. I will travel hundreds of miles. I will drop in on you once I know where you are." And then he ends the letter by saying, "I bid you a pleasant night's rest with a good appetite for breakfast, but I pray to God that you have enough for breakfast in the morning." When I think about this letter all the time, because I think what Hawkins Williams reminds us is the power of the black family, the desire of all of these people who, after being sold in bondage, spent the rest of their lives looking for their family. Now, the sad thing is, because the way this letter ended up, we know that they never found his family. But we also know that looking at late 19th century newspapers for 20 or 30 years after slavery, there were all these advertisements encouraging blacks to find their family. I think this is important because in some ways, at a time when many black families are splintered, it's important to remind ourselves of the extraordinary effort that African Americans made to keep families together. A powerful lesson today. I would argue that one of the other things that we ought to remember is the Great Migration. I think more than other activity during the 20th century, the Great Migration, this movement of millions of blacks from the rural South to the urban North, forever changed the tenor and tone of American cities. But it also changed the expectations, the desires, the needs, the demands of urban residents. This migration, as you know, began during World War I and continued really through the end of World War II. And what's important about this is that not only did this period move 1 million people from the South to the North, but it also gave for the first time this sense of political involvement by moving to northern cities, sense of home ownership. It really became a place, a sense of possibility for many. But it was also a call to recognize that discrimination and racism was as strong in the North as it was in the South. And yet I would suggest to you that it is the migration that dramatically begins to be a death knell for so much of the discrimination black folks face. Just think about the numbers. The population of black people in Chicago doubled from 1930 to 1950. And in Los Angeles, there were 1,000 black Americans living in LA in 1910. By 1920, there were 970,000. These kinds of numbers dramatically change these communities. I think what's important about this is that this tells us that African Americans were willing to grab what they needed to affect change. Think about just the economic differences. For example, in 1920, a black farmer living in the South would receive about 75 cents a day as a sharecropper, while wages in the North averaged $3 to $5 a day. So in some ways, this began to be the kind of practical choice where African Americans said, this is a way to begin to make our lives better. And I think in some ways, it is the migration that is one of the great moments for us to remember. We were fortunate when our colleague Spencer Crew curated that wonderful exhibition from Field to Factory now more than 20 years ago. It's time to remember to do that again. And I would suggest to you one other factor that is so important, which was something that we often forget, and that is the integration of the armed forces. When you go to the Air and Space Museum and look at that exhibition on Tuskegee Airmen, it is not simply a story of black flyers. It really is a story of men who proved their worth by handling what was considered the most difficult thing at the time, an airplane. And because of their exploits in war, they led dramatically, fast, to the executive order that led to the desegregation of the armed forces. And I would suggest to you that in some ways, one of the most important activities of the 20th century was the integration of the armed forces in terms of bringing people together, raising different issues, helping people to recognize that there were realities rather than just stereotypes. But I would also say to you that if I was saying one other thing that I want us to remember, and that is, I want us to remember Motown. African-American music, I know my staff thought I was going to say Sam Cooke, but I didn't. I said Motown. African-American music has always shaped in profound ways American culture. From the spirituals of the slaves, to the jazz of the 20s and 30s, to rhythm and blues of the urban migration, to hip-hop and beyond. And yet, it is often that music that is covered by white artists or controlled by producers who profit handsomely from the black community. This cycle was challenged in 1959 when Berry Gordy created Motown, a record that transformed the music industry. He created what he called the sound of young America. This distinctive sound, whether it was the voice of Smokey Robinson, no, I'm not going to sing, or Smokey Robinson singing Shop Around, or the Supremes telling us you can't hurry love, or the Temptations singing My Girl, captivated America. This music brought black culture to a mainstream at a time of a civil rights movement. But it also ensured that the African-American voice would be heard, would be visible. It ensured that African-American musicians and songwriters and producers would be legally protected for the first time. And while some might criticize Motown for taking the rough edges of black music and making it smooth, what's important about Motown more than anything else is it became for many young Americans their first real introduction to diversity and to the black experience. So in a way, I think the notion of remembering is crucially important, and black history helps us remember. But the second reason why it's so important to revel in black history is because of the power of inspiration. I would argue there is still this great need to draw inspiration, sustenance, and guidance from the African-American experience. And from this inspiration, people find tools to help them live their lives. The importance of inspiration really was brought home to me on a trip thousands of miles from here. In the 1990s, I was lecturing in South Africa in a little town called Pietermaritzburg, and this was in the middle of the Zulu territory. Nelson Mandela was coming to Pietermaritzburg to get the South African version of the key to the city called the Freedom of the City. And when Nelson Mandela came, he did as only Mandela could do. He would stand on this huge platform built on an old British colonial building, and he would talk, first in Zulu, then in Xhosa, then in Ndebele, but then finally in English. And he said in English that he wanted people to remember that during his 27 years in prison on Robben Island, one of the things that inspired him, that made him believe that change was possible, was the civil rights movement in America. He talked powerfully about Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, and Martin Luther King and John Lewis. And then he said, America, African Americans must remember, you have inspired the world. And in some ways, I sat there and I realized that he was absolutely right, that this culture, this history that we all love, inspired the world. And when you think about African American culture, who couldn't be inspired by the oratory, the commitment to racial justice, or the ultimate sacrifice of Dr. Martin Luther King? Or who could not be moved by the beauty of a Betty Saar piece of art, or the richness of the words of Langston Hughes, or the quiet bravery of John Lewis? In some ways, we are made better as Americans by our ability to draw inspiration from the African American experience. I would suggest to you the other reason why African American history is still so important, so vibrant, is that far too often, many view the African American experience as interesting, but exotic, as ancillary to the major story of America. Yet the story of how race, how African American culture has shaped and continues to reshape America is the story of America. It is important that we all grapple with and understand the centrality of race in our identity as Americans. And as Americans grapple with internal debates about who we are as a nation and what are our core values, where better to look than through the lens of African American history and culture? If one wants to understand notions of American resiliency, optimism, spirituality, sense of equality, things that we Americans believe symbolize who we are, where better than the African American experience? If one wants to explore the limits of the American dream, where better than by exploring the Gordian knot of race relations? If one wants to understand the impact and the tension that accompanies the changing demographics in our cities, where better than through the literature, the music of the African American experience? I would suggest to you, African American culture has the power and the complexity needed to illuminate all the dark corners of the American experience. It has the power to help us understand the ambiguity that is in so much of American life. So one of the great important reasons why this culture is so important and why we need to remember is because it helps us see who we are. And in fact, I would argue to you, more than anything else, the African American experience is an amazing mirror. It is a wonderfully unforgiving mirror that reminds us of America's ideals and America's promise. It's a mirror that makes us look at what we say we are versus who we are. It is a mirror that makes those who are often visible more visible. It is a mirror that gives voice to those who are often looked. It is a mirror that challenges us to be better, to work to make our communities, to make our country better. But it is also a mirror that helps us understand forgiveness and generosity and allows us to see our commonalities. It is America that allows us to celebrate and to revel, but it demands that we all struggle to fight the good fight. So in essence, it seems to me, Black History Month is still a month that serves us all well, in part because Woodson's creation was really as much about today as it was about the past. Experiencing this month every year reminds us that history is not distant from our lives. If we experience this month as what it is, a way to understand, to grapple with complexity, rather than to simply learn who invented the golf tee, you can begin to find a month that is usable and useful. As James Baldwin, one of my favorite authors, wrote in The Fire Next Time, history does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, that we are unconsciously controlled by it, and that history is literally present in everything we do. So I see the African American past as something that shapes all of us, that shapes me daily. Think about it. You might see the African American experience not in grand terms. It might simply be the way that your daughter reminds you of your great-grandmother when she laughs. Or it might be the way you take guidance and sustenance from your great-grandfather's decision to leave rural North Carolina and find a better day in New York City. Ultimately, African American history and its celebration in February is just as vibrant today as it was when Woodson launched it in 1926. Why? Because the most important thing it does is it forces us, it helps us, it calls for us to remember. And I would suggest to you, there is nothing more powerful than a people, than a nation steeped in its history. And there is nothing nobler than honoring our ancestors and our struggle by remembering. Thank you. Now, I was told I was to answer a few questions, and I'll talk about anything other than the fact that the Yankees are great and the Giants will win. But other than that, we can talk about anything else you'd like. If you have any questions, just let me know. I can't really see, so you'll have to go up to the microphone. Of course, I don't know where the microphones are, but they're somewhere in the back there. Oh, okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bunch.
Good afternoon.
I wanted to ask you, in terms of when you finally open the museum, what would be the structure of the experience? Will you do it in chronological order based upon the historical timeline of African Americans, or will it be thematic, say within the context of religion, education, et cetera, so on? And will you incorporate not only the history of the kidnapped, but also the kidnappers and the economic infusion into this country that made it an institutional element of slavery that had many business implications that we still deal with today?
Great question. I mean, I think that if you look at the creation of the National African American Museum of National Museum of African American History and Culture, I'm going to get paid more if I can figure out a way to shorten that name. I think that one of the things that we want to do is to give an insider's perspective so that you really get a deep understanding of the richness of African American culture. But I don't think that's enough. And what we have to do is help people see that African American culture is the best lens to understand America. So we have to help people understand that the experience of slavery is both an African American experience, but it's also a quintessential American experience. That you can't understand the Industrial Revolution, the economic opportunities that came to America without understanding that those opportunities were built on the backs of slaves. Our notion is that what we want to do is avoid the trap that happens often in national museums, whether it's here or other places, and that is you tend to sort of get the visitor going and you start an exhibition in 1635 and you go all the way to 1950 and the visitor collapsed about 1870. So part of our challenge is to recognize that people don't know African American history. So we have to provide timelines and sweeps so they can get it. But the most important thing is to provide a visitor experience in a way that you could understand the themes and the issues. And most importantly, the individuals that are shaped by the African American experience. What we want is we want everybody to go through and understand that this is not simply the story of the enslaved, but rather it's the story of William Prescott. It's the story of individuals who struggled, some who made it, some who did not. So our challenge is that crafting a national museum in a way that speaks to the diverse visitors that come here, that speaks to the international visitors, is one of the great challenges we have. And that's quite honestly part of the reason I came back, because it's one of the great intellectual challenges. I think a second challenge we have really is to make sure that you craft a museum, because you're going to be on the mall, so therefore it also has to be a museum rich with artifacts. It has to tell those stories in ways, so even if you do, as Oprah Winfrey once said to me, make the best videos you can. Well, even if you do that, if people come here to see the Greensboro lunch counter or the Wright Flyer or the Hope Diamond, you've got to make sure you've got those kind of artifacts that sing as well. So our challenge is great, but the joy of it is that there are people like Kinshasa Kanwu, my deputy director, and Jackie Serwer, who are doing all the hard work, and all I get to do is go, pretty good, not bad. They do all the hard work. Yes, sir.
I wanted to go back to what Dr. Du Bois did in 1903 when he predicted that the issue of the 20th century would be the issue of the color line. What do you see the issue of the 21st century being?
Oh, I think that Du Bois is still powerful in the 21st century. I think that race is going to be one of the major areas to wrestle with. I think the challenge is going to be that each generation looks at race differently. And to begin to figure out how do you ensure that generations like my kids understand and are steeped in the history, but also my generation is comfortable with their changing notions of race. So I think that's going to be, one of the big challenges of the 21st century. I think the other challenge is, quite candidly, it is trying to figure out what does race mean. When Du Bois said the color line, he meant black and white. As we move into the 21st century, it becomes much more blurred, much more difficult. I would argue that the African American experience still remains the central experience in many cases, but it means that we have to think more broadly than we've traditionally done. Yes.
I'm inspired to speak to you, Lonnie, because I can tell you from experience that there's no way to shorten the name. I've got a long name, so I've got one too, so you got to be stuck with it, I have to tell you. But I've certainly enjoyed your presentation and applaud you for reminding America that this whole celebration really began with an inspiration of many people, but certainly Dr. Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which still lives on, is very important to that celebration. I'd like you to maybe share with us a little bit. This time of year, I get a number of calls, and maybe you do too, from America that says, should we continue to celebrate Black History Month? I know you touched on it, but why do you think we get those questions?
Well, I think that, all right, let me try to answer it in a nice way. I think that part of the reason you get these questions is that we've set up a system where that's what's going to happen every February, is people say, is this still relevant? And I think that part of the issue is that many people want to argue that change has been so great that we don't have to wrestle with these questions anymore. And I think our ability, our need, our opportunity is to sort of embrace change, embrace the fact that the world is fundamentally different in many ways than the time it was when I was 3 years old. But on the other hand, there are still so many of those areas that are still there that we're still wrestling with. So that my argument when the reporters call me is that I ask them to tell me why they think it's changed, why they think it's no longer important, and they can't. I think the other reason that it's so important is unless we articulate why this is so important, then many future generations will miss the story. And I really think that the lack of historical literacy is one of the great fears and one of the great weaknesses I think we have in this country. I'm always amazed how when we travel overseas, kids in Israel or Liverpool know more about the Black American experience than many of the kids that I lecture to. That's a concern for me.
Thank you, and go Giants, homeboy.
That's right, go Giants.
I just want to add, just comment to the discussion about Black History Month. The presidential radio address yesterday, Laura Bush gave the radio address, and she began by saying that she wanted to announce that this is Heart Healthy Month. And I just want to put this into context that having a Black History Month is not a given, in that there are forces, there are those that would actually be happy with there not being one. So I appreciate what you're saying in these comments, and I think in that sense it's a very relevant issue and very important for us to think about that, because in that sense, if we don't carry that on and provide that, and I think about that in terms of the students and teaching every day, then there really will be those gaps, and they won't understand, well, why did we have a Black History Month? So I appreciate your comments.
Well, thank you. And I think that you've put your finger on what's an important consideration, which is those of us that care about this culture, regardless of who we are, have to be the keepers of the flame, have to carry this struggle. I'm always struck by, early in my career, I was collecting historical artifacts in a woman's home, and she had one of those old oval pictures we've all seen from the 19th century of a figure kind of almost like he was floating in the clouds, and this was her grandfather. And she said to me that she had the picture that I could collect, and in the picture was a membership card from the NAACP in 1913. And I had just collected some other NAACP material, so I wasn't sure if I really needed that. And she said to me, "You are not getting this picture unless you get this membership card." And I said, "Well, why?" Well, it turned out that when that picture was placed in 1915, her grandfather wanted the people in Pulaski, Tennessee to know that he supported the NAACP, so he put that card in there. So whenever you walked into his home, you saw that card. And it was a great example of African Americans saying, we will make sure the things we believe in, the stories we care about, are known. And that is really one of the great challenges before us today. Yes, sir.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Bunch.
Good afternoon.
To have you here this afternoon.
Thank you.
I had an absolutely extraordinary experience yesterday when, let me preface by saying that I am taking care of restoring, involved in resurrecting, let's say, a house that my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, built here in Washington. And we have been neighbors with another black family for a long time. And we've had virtually nothing but acrimonious interaction for decades. And something transpired recently, and all of a sudden I had this magnificent conversation with one of the descendants of that other family, and all of these barriers appear to be just melting away. And I think part of the reason for, first of all, the two families coming together was the insight of these predecessors 60, 70 years ago, and the opportunity that they saw for black people to buy land in a nice place. And they bought this land and they became neighbors. But the tensions that transpired over the years, there were other things besides the tensions, lots of good times and things like that, but the tensions, I think, have something to do with managing being black people in the larger the larger social context. And I would like to know, I think there are a lot of people who would like to be able to, or have the desire to plug their personal experiences into the overall context. I'd like to know if, I'm sure you've addressed this, you're thinking about it, but maybe you can give some particulars about how the museum might facilitate that.
I think the most important thing we can help people remember is that their individual family story is crucially important. That it is the story of your great-grandfather leaving the South, which is emblematic of the Great Migration. And part of what we're doing is we've created, as part of our new website, this wonderful memory book. And what this is we encourage everybody in this audience to do this. Thousands of people have put their family memory in this book, tell a particular story. That then allows them to be connected to other families, and suddenly you realize that the story of your grandmother and her daughters sewing together every week is really a way that traditions were passed on. Or the fact that a particular member of your family played in the Negro Leagues and was really sort of a symbol of the struggle against sort of segregation allows you to be connected to so many others. I think the most important thing we have to remember is it is the grand sweep that explains, but it is the individual stories that helps us understand.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I appreciate hearing you, what you have been doing, what you are doing, and what you will be doing. And I've heard you once before, and you're really great. But the question I would like to ask is, how, as someone who has reached the golden years, maybe I don't look it, but I have.
Oh, I thought you were calling me.
And I would like to know.
Give me a break. Okay, all
I
right,
would
sorry
like to
about
know, what can you do to motivate our youth, our young people, not only to learn about the history, but not to be ashamed of our history? Thank you.
I think that a challenge for any cultural institution, but especially this one, is how to help people come to history at a younger age. People tend to come to history after they've had some experiences. But yet the other side of it was that when you craft innovative programs that allow young children, teenagers, to control and help them understand why history matters, they get really excited. When I was president of the Chicago Historical Society, we created something called Teen Chicago, where we took a multicultural group of kids who basically said to me, I don't really care about history, so why are you asking us to do something? And we taught them how to do oral histories. We asked them to do oral histories and an exhibition on what it was like to be a teenager in Chicago over the last 100 years. And these kids began to interview their elders and their grandparents and people who had graduated in 1930 or whatever. And what happened was that they began to see the relevance of history. The best example is I took two young women to interview a woman who was in her 90s. And she had been an early black tennis player. And so they were interviewing her about tennis, and she said, and I remember the day that I went out to play tennis in my shorts, and the neighbors called my father, and he came home from work early to chastise me for wearing shorts. And one of the little girls looked at me and said, you mean to tell me parents were stupid even then? And this notion of, I said, yeah, we were, but I think this notion of recognizing that there is a real reason that history matters. So it's incumbent upon us who educate to not just worry, why aren't they caring about this, but to really make the argument, create programs that show, here's why history matters. And the other thing I would say is, I am always impressed that there are more kids who care about their culture and their past than I always think about. I'm amazed at the number of kids at high school I was at the other day. I was amazed at, I went to a series of sort of hip hop concerts, and it was all about storytelling and history. So in some ways, as long as we begin to recognize that is a challenge, but we articulate why we do this, I have great faith that we will help kids come to history at a younger age.
I'm really enjoying listening to everything you're saying. And my name's Duran, and both my grandfathers were doctors. One of my grandfathers is Oswald Duran, and there's an Oswald Duran Center in Alexandria, Virginia. And I bring that up because there's been struggles over the past getting funding for different black history preservation efforts. At one point, a lot of people didn't realize that Mr. Duran, my grandfather, was black until they actually found a picture of him and put it up in there, and there were efforts to try to then, you know, rename it and take things away. So my concern, and there's lots of black history attempts in the past. I think of like smaller museums, like maybe the Blacks in Wax in Baltimore, some other efforts in different states. Is your effort going to nationalize and try to bring resources together to help preserve black history in other state and local areas? Because you can't do everything. I think you should try to raise history to level, but where there are duplications of effort, or where there's maybe a rich museum or other center of history someplace that you can partner with, I'd like to know about the funding and the partnering with other efforts to preserve black history. And I'm just concerned that one attempt in the future may be to try to cut your budget.
Now, we play politics pretty well. But I also think that your question you've really raised is an important one, and that is the role of collaboration. The Smithsonian, to sort of quote Frederick Douglass, always acts as if it's the ship and all else is the sea. And one of the goals we have at the new museum is to recognize that there are hundreds of institutions and thousands of people in this country who have done this work, who can be made better by working with us, or who can make us better. So part of our goal is to create collaborative relationships, relationships that we've already started. For example, we announced an initiative called Save Our African American Treasures that we kicked off in Chicago a couple of weeks ago. And we partnered with the DuSable and the Chicago Public Library. And what we did is we had sort of hundreds of people come out on a day when it was -7 degrees below zero to bring historical artifacts. And we help people figure out how to preserve it in their homes. Some we encourage people, in fact, most of we encourage people to give it to the DuSable Museum or local institutions, and maybe only a small percentage might come back to the Smithsonian. Our goal is simple. We have failed if our work doesn't make the work of other African American history museums, other preservation societies. If our work doesn't make them better, we fail. So our goal is to recognize that, and I don't know what we're going to call it, but that in essence, in order to make sure this is central to what we do, I want to create a whole unit whose job it is simply to be outside of Washington, working collaboratively with institutions around this country. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much. I was certainly inspired by your comments about our history. And I just wanted to also make a comment, because I think it was so central to what you said, was this whole idea, this notion that, and I think Dr. King had the pulse of when he said in that, often we forget, he said in that I Have a Dream speech, he said it's not a new dream. He said it's deeply rooted in the American dream. Yeah, and so this is the whole, I think that's what I understood. You see, one of the major challenges is we help folks see that when you look at African American history, you're looking at American history. It's through this prism. So I want to thank you for that, because that is so key. My question is then, in your statistics that was taken, it said 80% of basically white folks said, well, you know, there's no need to have, but you said even more significant and certainly more challenge was that African Americans as a group of people felt there was no need. So I need you to suggest something that we can leave with here today that we can do, take back to our churches, take back to our communities, in the African American community, where we can to inspire them to realize that this is significant and it is relevant.
Well, and thank you very much for your question. I was talking very directly about the question of slavery. And that what I think is crucially important is to begin a dialogue that allows people in their churches and other places to talk about the enslaved, but talk about it rather than, you know, we see these pictures of people that are held in chains, but think about the enslaved as your great-great-grandmother or your great-great-grandfather. And it really allows you to begin to understand that their struggle and the strength that came out of that struggle has profoundly given us